I need to make an apology. In the glossary and probably in the first session, I mentioned the fact that Yeshua Jesus in the Greek means Hail Zeus in English. It actually doesn't. I've done some more research. My original research was wrong, but I've done some more research and found that that's not correct. And we'll go through the steps in a minute of how that came about. But I just want to say that we are a house of learning, and we are still learning. I'm still learning, and we're a Beit Midrash, so it's okay to make mistakes sometimes, as long as we go back and correct those mistakes, and that's what I'm doing here. So, we're open to discussion, we're open to debate, and we're open to correction when we have to, to make a correction when we have to. So never be afraid to sort of come to us and say, look, I don't think that's right. Can you do some more study? And we'll, we're open to that. Not a problem. But the confusion comes with the sound Zeus at the end of Jesus. And there's the word Pegasus, which is that flying horse, that mythical horse, was associated with Zeus. And what others that have done some research that's not quite correct have said, well, if Pegasus was Zeus's horse, then Jesus, with the S-U-S on the end, must also mean something to do with Zeus. So that's how that whole thing came about. But in reality, that's not how Jesus came about. So we'll look at a couple of steps of how we actually get from Yeshua to Jesus. So you see, we've got Y-E-S-H-U-A, Yeshua, that's his Hebrew name. Then we have to drop the A because there is no A in the Greek, or ayin, which is the Hebrew word, letter. Then we have to drop the sh sound because that doesn't exist either, so we have replace that with a S-O. And then also in the Hebrew we've got yeah, which doesn't exist in Greek, so it was translated to yeah or e, or I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but that's how the word was originally turned into Izu. But because Izu is not a name in Greek, it has to have the S at the end, Izus. And then eventually the O got dropped when it was translated into English, into the original King James. And then a little bit later in the next King James, they replaced the I with a J because there was no J sound in the Greek and it was originally I. And so that's how we get the name Jesus. So it's a quite complicated process. And in reality, Jesus or Izus does not mean Hail Zeus, but it also doesn't really mean anything as a word because it's pretty much a made-up word trying to transliterate from Yeshua to Jesus. It's sort of the word Jesus itself doesn't have a meaning like Yeshua does, and that's where I think it's probably important for us to understand. We all know that words and names in Scripture have meanings. We'll see. We saw in our Pesach study that Joseph meant what? Can you remember what Joseph meant? Sorry? To add to, yep. And then Benjamin meant at the right hand. So, and Benjamin came after Joseph. And so we saw that God does give specific names to people to have specific meanings. And unfortunately, the English translation of the Greek translation from the Hebrew no longer carries that original meaning. I did quite a bit of research on this because when I realized I said the wrong thing, I thought, well, I better actually find out, the truth. And so I watched a few videos, looked at a bit of teaching. Unfortunately, I came across a pastor who was trying to defend the name Jesus against the Yeshua crowd. So he was basically saying, this Yeshua thing's all wrong. He said, this was the context. He said, the angel said to Mary, or Miriam, that his name should be called Jesus, and because it was written in Greek. Okay, because the name was written in Greek, it should be called Jesus, and therefore we should be calling him Jesus and not Yeshua, which sort of could make sense if you were saying the whole apostolic writings were written in the Greek context, but we know they're not. We know that the apostolic writings are written in a Jewish context. So his argument was, well, it was to show that the Messiah was not just for the Jews, but for the whole world. Possibly a good argument, but it sort of still doesn't sound right, because if he really wanted to use the Greek, well, the angel said to Miriam, you shall call him Yeshua, which means Adonai saves, because he will save his people from sin. So if the Greek word were to transmit the meaning of God saves, Adonai saves, it would actually be, and I forgot the slide. Oh, there it is. It would actually be Adonai sozi, because that's the Greek explanation, or the Greek term for God saves, or the Lord saves, Adonai saves. So that's what we should be calling him, really. And even calling him Jesus is not quite correct, because it was in Greek. So that argument doesn't wash with me either.
Yeah, it's people misunderstand the Greek text. It was written off a Hebraic mindset and by Hebraic scholars.
Yeah.
So they were doing it for people who couldn't speak Hebrew. So if Miriam could speak Hebrew, what's the point? That's the point.
Or even Aramaic, because in Aramaic, the Yeshua is very similar to that name.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing is that originally in the King James, even Joshua or Yehoshua was translated as Jesus, because, again, as I said, they didn't have all the lettering. So this is out of Acts chapter 7, verse 45, which also our fathers that came after brought in with Jesus into the possession of the Gentiles. So that Jesus there is actually referring to Joshua, which they changed later on. They did change that. So in our modern versions of the King James or whatever, we do read Joshua there, but they never changed Jesus to his real name until recently, until we've come to that discovery. So I think the reason that they didn't change it was because of translators biased. The King James is very much full of replacement theology. A lot of things you'll see, a lot of things they've added is all about replacement theology. And so that's where I think the lack of translating his name correctly has come in as well.